Hello, I'm Simon Mills, and I'm self-care lead for the College of Medicine in the UK. Long time ago, I studied medical sciences at Cambridge and have long had a big interest in how the body works and particularly how people look after themselves and how they do things for themselves. So for a long time, I've been practicing herbal medicine, studying herbs, and I've also been involved in academic work. We set up a centre at the University of Exeter in the 1980s. I've worked with the Department of Health on a big self-care project. A lot of that's up there on our website, our health directory. We'll see more of that later. I've also recently started working with Pucker, the herbs people, and sell the teas and the supplements, and have really enjoyed the way in which they are bringing the health and well-being revolution together. However, this is not a Pucker promotion. I'm doing this very much on my own, and this is very much a project for the College of Medicine. So my lovely colleague at Pucker, Joe Webber, who runs the education department, always says you should have infographics. So the way I thought of doing this was to set this up as a moving infographic. We want to talk about how we can look after ourselves during this pandemic. And I've spent a lot of time looking at the research and the clinical evidence coming in from the front line, coming in day by day. And I hope what we've got is something that makes sense, is evidence-based, and is above all very practicable. My main point to make, of course, is that in no way am I saying we're going to cure or fix COVID-19. We're looking at ways in which we can make ourselves stronger in the face of it. So without more ado, let's share my screen, which should be coming up soon. Yep. And there is a PowerPoint. I'll close that down. And I'm hoping you can see the screen. We talk a lot about the immune system and how what we want to do above all else at the moment is to get our immune functions working well. But immunity is a very big thing. If in total, it's got your name on it. So everything that you do is part of the immune system. Every part of you works for the immune system. But what we want to do is to pick on the bits that are particularly important now. And to do this, I've got a diagram here, which I shall build, which looks at the immune system in rings of defense. And these rings do have names to them. So we have barrier immunity, innate immunity. We have the whole section on inflammation and fever. And we have finally acquired or specific immunity. Let's just look at, although we also have here the white blood cells that are particularly involved in various immune functions. Let's start at the top. So the barrier immunity is right at the top and the outside. It's working all the time. Its responses are instant. It's the skin, it's our airway defenses, it's the saliva in our mouth, it's the acid in our stomach, and it's the good bacteria in our gut, otherwise known as the microbiome. And if these are working well, any infection is dealt with without us even knowing about it. It's right at the surface. If an infection does get into the system...
Sorry, Simon, just to cut in, your screen share hasn't gone on yet.
Ah, thank you. I better double check. How does I'll get out of that. Sorry, folks. We will share screen.
That's us.
Is that better?
Yep, great. Thanks, Simon.
Can you see the screen now?
Yep, perfect.
All right, I will. Technical difficulties as ever. So back up, sorry about that. So we've got these layers of immunity, just rehash on that. So on the outside, we have our skin, our airway defenses, the things that will look after infection without us even knowing about it. If anything does get into the system, we have what we call innate immunity, which takes a few hours to work up. And these are the white blood cells we call phagocytes. We used to call them Pac-Men. They're the ones that go gobbling things up. They're very fast. They're very efficient. They get rid of things quickly. And they're associated with a bunch of chemicals called complement, cytokines, and interferons, all of which work quickly and directly to neutralize any infection. And that's very quick. It's called innate immunity. It's not very specific, very fast and furious. If things get even further, then within 4 days, we have the third level of defense, which is what we call inflammation or fever stage, which we're getting increased blood flow, increased activation of the blood wall defenses, white blood cells start moving into the tissues, histamine and other cytokines are released. We begin to feel sore, we begin to feel feverish, we don't feel very happy at this point. This is, as you see, a relatively short-term thing, lasts in the first few days. And then the final stretch, and this is when things really get clever and also complicated, from days to weeks after we produce antibodies, we produce T cells. These are very specific to the type of infection. They take several days to work up and is obviously a much more complex and more long-term condition. So response. So if we now bring in the bad guys, in this case, we're bringing some viruses in. These are incidentally very, very small. So on the scale of the white blood cells down there, you wouldn't see them. So we have to do a little bit of artistic license here. But let's imagine these guys are assailing us. So they start intruding into the system, and with a bit of luck, we can fend them off before they get into the system. And at this point, there are no symptoms whatsoever. Now, we know with COVID-19, we might still be infectious at this point, but the key thing is that we don't know it. And it seems from some of the evidence we're getting from places like the USA, Italy, and so on, that up to half of the population may get COVID-19 without knowing about it. And this is particularly, I think, the children, the younger people, many of whom will get this without any symptoms at all. And obviously, from the point of view of our health, that's a good thing. So I've got 3 ticks there. Well done. But if it gets beyond that, we get into this innate immunity we talked about earlier, where things mobilize quite quickly. And in the text along there, you'll see that I've highlighted a couple of things in purple. So in the case of viruses, interferons become very important at this point. And the symptoms we get are aches and pains. We feel nauseous. We don't feel well. We get very tired. And in the case of COVID, we start getting a cough. At this stage, we could still fend this off and have very few problems. And a majority of people actually don't let this get much further. But it could get further, and at this point we get the fever that everyone talks about. This is when the body really starts getting worked up. There's more pain involved, there's more fatigue, and if it goes well, there's a recovery, although it'll be a slower recovery. But we start introducing risks, and there's an alert sign there. There's more risks of things like pneumonia in the case of COVID, with other inflammation like arthritis and so on. But we could still fend this off. This could still be a recovery phase, and we get 1 tick for progress there. But if that doesn't work, then we increasingly require the antibodies and the T cells to get active, and this is very more complex. It's very efficient if it works well, so you can get proper healing and reduce symptoms. But there's increasing risks of immune complications, immune damage, kidney disease, sepsis, and in the worst case scenarios, you get organ failure. And of course, finally, some people unfortunately died. So you can see that the job we want to do is to keep the infection way out at the surface. We don't want to involve the antibodies, antigens too much. They will always get involved at some point, but we want to keep the fight into the outer rings of the defense. Now, of those who get, and important to say this, of those who get COVID-19, 80% from all the figures we're getting have mild symptoms. So that's even beyond those who get none at all. Of those who get symptoms at all, 80% have mild to moderate symptoms, and mostly, therefore, are engaging with COVID in these upper layers. It's the other 20% where things can get more troublesome. What we want to do is to reduce our chance of getting into that danger zone. So let's have a quick look at one of these phases, the one that I want to pick on, which is that one involving inflammation and fever, because of the ways in which we can help ourselves, that does look like being the most productive. So we'll break that out a little bit more and introduce you to what happens at the small blood vessels. This is a capillary showing here, and you can see something called the endothelium. That's the capillary wall, and at the bottom wall you'll see something called endothelial activation. Now, when there's a toxin, when there's some trouble afoot, the first thing that happens is that cell wall of the capillaries becomes activated, and it becomes sticky, a bit like Velcro. And the white blood cells that are charging around the bloodstream start sticking to the wall of the capillary, break their way through, and go through into the tissues. And at that point, inflammation is beginning. So any inflammation, any inflammatory disease starts with the endothelium. So another question which is now relevant: what conditions are most vulnerable to COVID-19 complications? And from all the evidence, starting with China and going around the world now, it's pretty clear that those are the conditions which are most likely to be troublesome, particularly high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes. We now also understand that overweight and obesity is also a complication. If you've got cancer or been having cancer treatment, if you've got serious lung disease, and if you've got liver and kidney problems, you're also more likely, but you're also likely to be less well in other ways as well. The headline ones are these to do with the circulation, and that makes COVID and this coronavirus very different from flu. It's important to make that point. There's something about those liabilities that we need to focus on. So there's one question that has quickly come up recently, which is in relation to high blood pressure, and we just need to address that quickly. Blood pressure is raised by an enzyme called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, and several blood pressure drugs like ramipril and candesartan either block that or inhibit the process. The body also produces something called ACE2, which naturally counterbalances ACE, and those drugs that I've talked about happen to increase the production of ACE2. ACE2 is important for us. It helps to protect the lungs, so it's obviously critical during this infection. However, the cells that produce ACE2 we now are targeted by coronaviruses, including COVID-19. So it has been suggested that patients taking these types of medication for their blood pressure may be increasing routes for infection by this coronavirus. However, new evidence coming in actually suggests the opposite. And the most important thing to say is don't by yourself to come off these medicines, because the increase in blood pressure that results may itself be a worse risk. So we still have other reasons possibly to consider why these conditions make you more vulnerable. The first thing is if you've got severe heart disease, you're more vulnerable to lung problems and lung infections. If you have medicines for certain conditions like cancer and diabetes, they also raise the risk directly. Obviously, if you've got lung and liver and kidney disease, they're also making you more vulnerable. But I want to come back to this blood vessel and blood wall, the endothelial story, because it does seem to be really central. There is something called endothelial dysfunction, where you get damage to this process, you get increased inflammation, and that we now know leads to things like heart disease and other chronic diseases. You get loss of elasticity in the blood vessels, which leads to high blood pressure. You get blood vessel wall damage and increased clotting, which leads to more stroke and thrombosis. And this is interesting. The whole thing gets worked up a lot in if you get too much carbs and too much sugar in the blood, you get increased insulin resistance over the years. That leads to diabetes and directly makes the endothelium work badly. So we now can see that endothelial dysfunction has a critical role and link with all the things which make you liable to COVID complications. Endothelial dysfunction causes high blood pressure, causes heart disease, causes diabetes, and these all have their own reverse effects. But above all, diabetes and overweight are known to be main factors in encouraging endothelial dysfunction. Now, on the right-hand side of each of these screens, you'll see a link to our health directory. There's a lot more information about all this. If you go there after this talk, you can find out more, including some of the science behind this. So I just wanted to highlight that this really does seem to be a key talking point in how we might look after ourselves, particularly in relation to this infection. So the obvious question is, what can we do about it? What can we do to reduce endothelial dysfunction? The good news is there is quite a lot that we can do ourselves at home. So the first thing, above all else, is to eat more plants. Now, these are plants of all sorts, vegetables, fruits, cereals and grains, nuts and seeds, herbal teas and green tea, and cocoa and dark chocolate, which is for pudding. You'll notice lots of colors there because the colors are the key. And here's a little chart here which gives you one reason why vegetables and plant materials in general are helpful, because all the things on this chart increase what are called endothelial nitric oxide. This is one of the really good guys in helping endothelium to work better. And so all of these things are basically good things. You'll see there's other things alongside the plants there. We've got olive oil, we've got fish oil, there's a few herbs, garlic there, a bit of red wine, which of course you drink with all discretion, but you'll see the grapes and the berries and the beans and the other fruits there as well. So one very good reason of having lots of plants is because they directly support your endothelium. They do it in another way as well. They all contain chemicals called polyphenols, flavonoids, anthocyanidins, lignans, which we know improve many endothelial functions directly. They prevent many forms of circulatory and heart disease, and are increasingly exciting. The thing about polyphenols is that they all have colors, back to those again, and we used to be told to eat our greens when we were small. We should now be asking our children, have you eaten your rainbow today? Asking them to identify red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple foods, and have they had all of them today? And there's a lovely chart there which shows some of the benefits of things with colors. So one of the really take-home messages is have as much variety of plants, colored plants, as possible to help reduce this endothelial risk. Another thing we can easily do is to reward ourselves with really good 70% cocoa dark chocolate. There's a lot of science behind this now, and it makes a really good reward for your hard day at lockdown. There's quite a lot of it there. You might need to share that. But there's no doubt that a certain amount of cocoa really does help your endothelium. So do enjoy it. Another thing that's really coming up fast is the important role of spices, and the key ones that have really shown promise are turmeric, ginger, and cinnamon, all of which you can easily incorporate in your cooking. They have been shown to have positive effects on endothelial health, and there's some really good evidence that they do this even when you combine them with fatty foods. So the effect of fatty carbohydrate type foods is reduced if they're also combined with these spices. and other evidence to show that the effect of the spices is really, really quick. There was a lovely research study in Japan which showed that even one curry meal made a major difference to the circulation of the volunteers who were being checked on that. Some of the spices reduce blood pressure, and they all help with immunity and microbiome defenses elsewise. So do check your kitchen cupboard and stock up where possible with fresh spices, and there's different ways you can do this. The first is to eat more like an Asian, so try Asian and Middle Eastern recipes at home, and don't just pinch on the spices, just pile them in. Most of the good ones involve spoonfuls of spices, and the picture shows the average spice intake of the average Indian villager per day, to give you an example of how we might be falling behind here. You can up your intake by looking for supplements of each of these, and of course you can top it up with various herbal teas that contain these spices. A big thing from what we've seen, cut down on the carbs, because foods that release sugars quickly into the circulation put a heavy load on the endothelium. They increase insulin resistance and directly lead to endothelial dysfunction and more inflammation. It's a straight line equation. Being overweight makes it worse because the cells that store fat also provoke inflammation. But the really good news is that you can reduce insulin resistance problems almost overnight if you cut back hard on these fast foods, these fast carbs, and you might even lose a bit of weight as well. If you want to know more about that, just go and search for high glycemic index foods, and it'll list the foods that push most sugar into the blood for you, so you can guide your diet around that. There's further support. This is not directly on endothelium, but it all helps with our protection here. Vitamin D is really stepping up. We're getting quite a lot of information that it's directly helpful in this pandemic, but you can see it also reduces blood pressure, and it's protective on inflammatory lung injuries, so it's right on the button for this infection. The simplest way of taking it is to get some sun on you, and you can take it anywhere. If you've got a window, it's best to remove the glass if you can, because it's better without the glass in the way. But just getting sun on your face and your arms for a half an hour a day, longer if you've got darker skin, will be enough to provide your necessary vitamin D. But you may need to take a supplement or top up with fish, eggs, mushrooms, all of which have vitamin D of their own. Exercise, this is a rather confusing thing. If you have too much exercise, you can actually weaken your immune system. If you have too little, you get the same problem. So you need a moderate amount of exercise, and we sometimes have to do this at home now, or with our permitted exercise routines. But the aim is for moderate exercise. A brisk walk for 5-15 minutes, where you get your breath pumping, will be enough to get your system ticking over, and there's almost certainly some benefits for endothelium and insulin resistance by doing that each day. So get walking. This is something that came out of China. They noticed that there was a lot of hammering of the healthy bacteria in the gut with people who were getting bad effects with COVID. And so they thought that it was important to bump up the healthy gut flora. So we have prebiotics and probiotics. Probiotics, the one most people are familiar with. These are things like yogurt and kefir and so on, fermented foods that actually add healthy bacteria to the gut. But you can also support the healthy bacteria by eating foods that are what we call prebiotics, that help to nourish bacteria in the gut. So getting as much of that sort of food into you is almost certainly going to be helpful as well. Mushrooms, this has really been quite a surprising thing. There's a lot of new evidence to show that mushrooms really do support your immune defenses. They were always traditionally used in the recovery from fevers and infections and so on, to build up strength. And the old mushroom soups that you get in Asia were very much seen as convalescent foods. The most commonly used mushrooms in Asia are reishi, shiitake, and maitake mushrooms, and they're often combined in various supplements. But you can probably get similar benefits just by bumping up your mushroom intake in your diet as well. Finally, in the immune support, I'm looking at a few herbal remedies, which is the area that I know quite a lot about. And there's been some that have demonstrated benefits in reducing either the severity or frequency of respiratory viral infections like colds and flu. No evidence, of course, for COVID yet. I haven't had time for that. But they mostly work on improving your immune defenses in a general way. So they may be worth trying. You can still get them from supermarkets, from pharmacies, from health food stores that are remaining open. And if you're careful with who you get them from, you can also have them delivered online. So pelargonium is widely used as a medicine, actually a traditional medicine in Europe, specifically for protecting against viral infections in the airways. Andrographis comes from India, and there's a lot of evidence to show that it directly protects at the surface against viral infections. Echinacea, a lot of people have heard of. Most of the evidence there relates to it may reduce the likelihood of getting an infection rather than treating the infection when it comes in, but it's still worth thinking about as a preventative. And elderberry has shown, particularly in the form of syrup, to be really good at directly helping to counteract the effects of viruses in the airways and throat area particularly. So back to our tiers, our defensive rings. And so now I'm going to put the key remedies in roughly the sort of place where you might find them most helpful. So vitamin D definitely helps on the barrier immunity, and mushrooms are fairly close to that level. But when you get down into that area we were talking about earlier, the endothelial dysfunction, the things that really come onto their own obviously are plant foods, spices, exercise, and probiotics and prebiotics. We can add a few herbs in there on the same spectrum, and you can see that there are a range of ways in which we can hopefully keep COVID infection away from trouble. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I'm just about on the button, and so I will start taking questions and answers as as people want to chat. I've already seen quite a few comments here. Mainly people can't see the screen. So yeah, it's come through. I'm glad to see that you all saw that. So I will take questions for the next half hour, and there will be an opportunity also to contact me and the rest of the College of Medicine through the website that you saw about earlier. And I will start picking up on some of the questions. First one is from Patricia. Would a healthy immune system help fight the virus? The immune system is the way in which we fight viruses. That is how we look after ourselves. And I hope what I was saying is that the immune system has got complex layers, and what we really want is a healthy surface immunity rather than involving some of the more complex, difficult areas that we identified with the antibody-antigen system. Quite a few nice comments. Thank you very much for that. A couple of specific questions from people with clinical conditions, which I might be able to answer separately to you. How can we make this more widely known in medicine? Very good point. I think one of the lessons we learned over the years is that medicine's very good at fighting things when they happen, but spends lesser time on prevention and on things particularly we can do for ourselves. I'm hoping that this talk will help you to pick up on things that really you could help yourself with. We're not curing anything, we're just making ourselves stronger. So why is this not widely known? I think it's as I say, it's a question of priorities. People are in the front line now, saving lives. We've got the slight luxury of being stuck at home, looking after ourselves, where we really do have to take on self-care. There's questions in the Q&A box. So yes, first one says, I'm curious about the possible effect of low neutrophil count on the process of fighting off COVID-19. So one of the first things that happens actually is you get a big drop in neutrophils and other white blood cells, one of the markers of COVID infection. Part of that is because they're off in the tissues fighting the fight. So as you saw earlier on, the endothelium is the wall between the bloodstream and the rest of the tissues. In that first stage of immunity, the white blood cells vacate the blood and go off into the tissues fighting things. So we haven't lost them, they're just in a different place. So part of what I was talking about was building up our white blood cell count levels. So hopefully that will look that will, if we look after cells, that will be doing fighting a good fight. The comment there about Japanese work on high levels of problems with fermented foods. Interesting point. There is only a bare amount of information about things like diet factors in COVID. We are watching this literally day by day. At the moment, probiotics and prebiotics look like a savvy thing to do, but as and when we find new evidence, we will update our webpage. So do keep coming back to it. It literally is updated daily. So hopefully we can keep on top of some of these new bits of evidence coming through. So the question about diabetes, thank you, Emma. Regarding which conditions are most vulnerable, is this for both type 1 and type 2? It's actually mostly type 2, Emma. That's because there's a long process leading up to type 2 we call pre-diabetes or metabolic syndrome, in which there is years of increasing insulin resistance. And that was what I was highlighting earlier on as being one of the main risk factors likely emerging in this, because of the damage it does to the endothelium. In type 1, you've got a completely different process going on. So in relation to your son, I don't think he's particularly liable because of his type 1 diabetes. It's those of us who are a bit older, but carrying a few extra pounds, that are the ones who seem to be most vulnerable. Angela, thank you for your thanks. There is a video available and it will be on YouTube. So HealthFlix has got a link to the YouTube videos. All of the videos in the series will be available for you to look at again. A question about autoimmunity problems. That is clearly, by definition, a complex situation. Autoimmunity involves those deep levels of the immune system I was talking about earlier, the antibody-antigen system. And by the time you've got an autoimmune disease, you're in the middle of a sort of very complex web of interactions. How you manage that is going to be on a case-by-case basis. One potentially good news is that at least your immune system is very alert, and sometimes it's so involved in its own problems that it doesn't have much time to deal with it doesn't think much of a extra viral input. So you're not necessarily more vulnerable, but it depends on how ill you are feeling. Evidence that virus, thanks Raja, evidence the virus is attacking the hemoglobin and causing hypoxia. And what herbs can we offer for that? I really don't know. This is, again, very on the edge of the evidence base. We certainly aren't going to offer herbs at that level of assault, because we're getting really past our first levels of defense here. And I think I'm going to have to pass on that one. and leave that for another day. Thank you for doing that. How many IUs of vitamin D daily? You know, I can't remember. Read the pack, and I always say, if take the regular dose that's on a good, well organized supplement. If you really need it because of a particular condition, then just double that dose in the short term. But on the whole, the dose that is recommended on the label is the one that is your starting point. Sorry about that, Bridget. Anne, I think I know who you are. How do you feel about nettles for use with that first stage common ivy leaves, because they're anti-inflammatory to the respiratory tract? Yes, I can see that there's a lot of herbs that, you know, if I was out in the countryside, or if I was at my dispensary, I would be picking on, and I'm actually helping people with COVID right now, and there's a whole range of things that we use depending on the symptoms. But those tend to be individual. You tend rarely to want to focus on individual problems rather than make general statements. The ones that I was referring to earlier, and are the ones that have the evidence base behind them, and those are the ones that we're more are safest to promulgate and to share with the wider population. Interesting question from Jeanette in relation to licorice, conflicting use. I'm a great fan of licorice. There are problems if you take too much of it for a long period of time, but you really do have to pump it in. In small quantities, there's actually quite a lot of evidence to show that it does help in some of our defenses against viruses and other things as well. It works on a number of fronts, including in the gut, and it's one of the things that I have in my back locker for regular use. But I really don't see any problems with this particular infection and licorice, Jeanette. So with caution about not overdosing it, I would feel quite happy with recommending that as a regular drink, for example, in teas, elsewise, to have a moderate amount of licorice. Sandy, question about supplements, the downside being that they don't have the bioavailability of whole foods. That's a really good point, and I've written quite a lot about this issue of bioavailability, for example, in turmeric. And one of the real lessons that we can share is that, you know what, it doesn't matter, because the gut wall itself is one of the major interfaces with the rest of it is the major interface with the rest of the world. And all you need to do is work on various mechanisms on the gut wall, and you can get all sorts of magical effects going on in the brain and the rest of the body, simply with all the connections that there are in the gut wall. So if a supplement stays in the gut, for me, that's quite a good place to be. So I wouldn't worry too much about the bioavailability front. There are some things like minerals and so on that you need to absorb, but if you're talking about some of the other supplements, don't worry too much about that. You talk about vitamin D as being non-plant based. There's two types of D, D3 and D2, and the D3 is the one that's you get from the sunshine. You also get from animal sources. From plants deliver D2, which is inferior, but it still provides useful D impact. So ideally sunshine, moderate amounts, foods like fish and eggs, if you can eat those, and then if you are relying on plants, just bump them up so that you can make up in quantity what you lose in efficiency. Hazel, herbal remedies safe to take for someone on meds for blood pressure, diabetes, and lung conditions like fibrosis? That depends entirely on the condition, Hazel. My patients sometimes do have blood pressure, diabetes, and lung problems, but clearly you have to be more careful if they're taking meds as well. And that's not a subject, I think, that we can just blithely rattle on about. That's very much an individual thing. The more medicines you're taking from the doc, the more you have to be careful about self-medicating with other things. Hi, Sue, I know who you are. Have I seen any confirmed cases yet? Yes, I have, and dealing quite a few of them, obviously not in person, but remotely. They have gone through various stages, and one or two quite badly. And so we've had to deal with all sorts of ways of relieving comfort. It's interesting, of course, that unless you get really, really bad infection, you're advised not to trouble the doctor. So there's a lot of self-care going on here, and we are increasingly having to do it. Matt Hancock has told, this is Jessica, has told people not to sunbathe. It's against the rules, says the college. Can the College of Medicine inform him it's good for people, particularly those without gardens? I think what Matt Hancock's talking about is people going out and sitting in public parks and littering up the parks. That's the problem with sunbathing. He wants to, and so does the government, and so does everybody else, wants to keep people on the move and away from each other. And the more people congregate in parks for sunbathing, the less that's likely to happen. So yeah, sunbathing has obviously got its risks, so you don't want to overdo it. But as we were saying earlier, 15, 20, 30 minutes of sun on your exposed bits of you are likely to bump your vitamin D levels nicely. What are the markers of the COVID infection, Mariana? Well, the main symptoms that people are getting are fever and cough, but there are other symptoms that people have been reporting: loss of taste. You can get upper respiratory problems. You generally feel like muck, like a lot of other fevers, but it's the fever and the cough that are the particular ones associated with this coronavirus. Message from Lenka about her husband taking Ramipril. Do carry on. There is new evidence, Lenka, coming in that people who are taking Ramipril actually getting some benefits. So some of the talk about Ramipril and candesartan being a risk problem are unlikely to hold up, and the risk of stopping it is that the blood pressure goes up, which itself adds further trouble. So I would stick with it and just look at everything else we've been talking about to protect yourself. Jane says, can the barrier system destroy the virus before it enters the body and progresses to the other layers? Yes. And as I was saying before, the screen came up, about anywhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of people who have so far been found to have been exposed to the virus had no symptoms. So we can know for that that the virus never troubles their other parts of their immune system. So we do have these amazing defenses right on our periphery, on our surfaces, in the linings of our mouth and the gut and the lungs, that can deal with viruses without us even knowing about it. So that's ideal. If they're working well, then we don't have a problem at all. Someone suffering from hay fever, that's Alison. Can you make it more likely to be immune depressed? No, actually, hay fever is the other way around. Hay fever is actually your immune system overdoing it. It can sometimes get tired, but in the process of defending yourself against pollen, is probably also helping to protect you a little bit from other things as well. So don't be worried about that score. Yeah, the slides are available. Well, actually, having said that, what I'll probably do is post the slides on the Our Health directory page, so anyone who wants to download them can do so from there. So thanks, Jessica, for the prompt. I'll get that sorted. Are we at risk of BMI 30 plus, not just 40 plus? Yeah, thanks for that. There's definitely greater risks the higher your BMI or your weight is. So real obesity is definitely a risk factor, but there is evidence to show that the more higher your BMI, the greater your risk. And that definitely relates to your insulin resistance problems that I talked about earlier. Georgios, they get another story about autoimmune problems. As I said earlier, that's definitely an individual story. It goes all sorts of different ways. That's a question. But the question is, can they take echinacea as a preventative measure? Yes, is the answer. We actually had a good hard look at echinacea at this point, and we have one of the world's experts of echinacea, Kerry Bone in Australia, who did a really thorough paper on the risks here. The effect of echinacea is definitely at the surface areas of our immune defenses. There is really no reason at all to worry about it boosting things or stirring things up deeper in the system. Any ideas from Jeanette? Any ideas on why healthy people with no obvious underlying health conditions seem to be getting poorer than expected? Yeah, one of the questions I think, Jeanette, is viral load. So you might remember one of the first real tragedies was the Chinese doctor who was a whistleblower and who died early on with this, and he was quite young. It was thought that he just really had too much of the stuff, and there's been a high vulnerability with people who spend a lot of time close up to victims. So people like ophthalmologists and so on, who ear, nose and throat people were early on identified as vulnerable among the health staff. So I think the main reasons why healthy people get ill is because they get a heavier load. For most of us who only get marginal exposure from touching something or inhaling a few things, then our usual defenses can switch in and protect us if they're working well. And the question from Janine about her son as a doctor is the viral load. So that picks up what we were saying earlier. Those really brave people who are working on our behalf on the front line really do need their protection, their protective gear, their face masks and the rest, because they are simply the quantity of material they're getting. You've got a question about what to take, and you suggest antigraphis. That's one of the ones I would actually suggest, that someone who's is being exposed to frontline viruses consider, because of all the ones that we know about, that seems to be the one that has most, but it's rather hard to get. I think I'm not the only one who's figured that one out. The demand for antigraphis has gone through the roof. So good luck with trying to find that. Will quality, this is from someone who's anonymous, will quality relaxation reducing stress help the immune system? Absolutely. Sleep also. I haven't had time to go into all of that, but anything that reduces your stress levels by looking at a nice view, by getting your sleep levels up, by taking a walk, it's really important actually. Exercise is one really good way of reducing your stress, and breathing, as you say yourself, breathing exercise of all sorts are really quite good at relieving stress. Question from Abby: is it wise to take prophylactic tinctures if we are already completely isolated? Your husband's got cancer, we're not going out. And that's the key thing. If you can keep yourself well protected from outside contamination, every time you come in, you wipe your door handles and all the rest of it, wipe things that have been brought in with spirit, but preferably soap is a really good way of keeping viruses at bay. Viruses do not like soap. So just keeping everything as decontaminated as possible is really your best bet. The rest of it is going to be a very personal one, depending on how one's health is impacted. You're worried about overloading, which is a fair point. So, do contact if there is a particular question you have. There's another question about the echinacea one, Maria. Thank you for that. I think we're running a bit out of time anyway, so I already talked a little bit about that. There's some really good evidence out there about echinacea if you want to follow it up. And the final one I'm going to take, which from Geraldine. What are your thoughts about infrared therapy? It's not infrared that we look for in the sunshine, is the ultraviolet. So infrared is simply a warming device. It does help to bring blood to an area, and that also brings white blood cells and other defensive things. So if you've got somewhere that's localized, like you've got an arthritic joint or something, infrared can help there, but I don't think it's particularly appropriate here. Okay, I think we're going to close at that point. I'm running out of time. We've got the next speaker on. So at this point, I shall close down and thank you for your attention, and stay well, stay out of trouble, look after yourself, look after your endothelium, eat lots of plants. You got it. Thank you.